Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a late edition this evening of the October meeting for the New York ARSC local chapter for the 2019 to 2020 season. This evening we have once again Matt Barton, who's going to give a program on Harlem on the record. Clap, clap, please, please. We have to let our YouTube audience know there is somebody else here instead of me and Matt's just standing up here. Recorded Sound Curator at the Library of Congress and past president of ARSC. What do we say?
Recovering president.
Recovering president of ARSC, yes. Matthew Barton explores the rich and varied legacy of recorded sound in Harlem. From the days of the pioneering Black Swan label in the early 20s to the birth and growth of hip-hop in more recent times. This will be an eclectic survey touching on many artists, genres, communities, labels, and venues. It is hoped that this program will encourage interest in a future symposium that can explore Harlem's recorded sound history in both greater length and greater depth. A little history of our guest, who really doesn't need an introduction, but we must do it for the video people out there. Matt Barton became the curator of the recorded sound at the Library of Congress in 2008. From 1996 to 2003, he was production coordinator of the Alan Lomax collection of CDs that was issued as a series. He has written extensively on recorded music and sound and is a contributor to the 2012 book, The Ballad Collectors of North America. His two-year term as president of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections concluded in May of 2018, and he's been counting every day ever since, right?
Right.
May I introduce Matt Barton? It's all yours for the evening.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got something on my screen here that you can't see, but I do, so I'm just going to try and get rid of that. No. There we are. Okay. Can you read that? Amateur Night in Harlem? Yeah. Okay. Well, early last year, I think in February, we did a tribute to Bobby Robinson with the help of John Brovin and others. Bobby Robinson, who operated the Happy House record store on 125th Street from the 40s into the 21st century, and who also operated several record labels there, recording local and national artists and enjoying hits like Wilbert Harrison's Kansas City and Lee Dorsey's Ya Ya. It just seemed like a good thing to do since it was more or less in the neighborhood. And John and I got to talking about, wouldn't it be an interesting idea to have a symposium just devoted to recording in Harlem? So this is sort of a step in that direction. I'm not going to present myself as an expert on Harlem. And, you know, in this company, I'm a peer, but not an expert on recording. But I've been looking into this ever since then. And, you know, I always knew that Harlem had a rich and varied cultural life and a rich and varied musical life. And that, you know, this would surely be reflected in recording activity, and I was not disappointed. There are many independent labels based here, and also people who were very much a part of the daily cultural and musical life of Harlem, who got to record for major labels and labels outside of Harlem. In this presentation, I'm going to favor recordings made by labels based in Harlem by artists, not necessarily based in Harlem, but who were very much a part of Harlem's musical life. Some were born in New York, born in Harlem, some came from elsewhere. In a couple of cases, I have to venture out of Harlem when recording companies happen to be the only ones to record. Recording companies, that is, outside of Harlem happen to be the only ones to record certain things. But for the most part, what you're going to hear it originates in Harlem on a Harlem label. So anyway, and this is one of them, the Apollo label. It came out of a record store, the Rainbow Record Store, I think it was called, which was on 125th Street near the Apollo Theater, and was founded by Bess Berman and her husband in 1944. And they were actually only based in Harlem for about the first 18 months. Even though they recorded many, many, many good records of all kinds, from everything from the Yiddish-based humor of the Barton brothers, no relation, I'm sorry to say, to Mahalia Jackson's great gospel singing. But while they were on 125th Street, they did record this tribute to Amateur Night at the Apollo, and it's delivered by Willie Bryant, the band leader who was the self-style and also acclaimed mayor of Harlem. So let's hear this.
What do you mean we won't Canada? Don't let Mr. Schiffman hear you say that. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Willie Bryant, your master of ceremonies, coming to you from the stage of the 125th Street Apollo Theater, and it's your amateur night in Harlem. Hello there, Shoebrice. Why, there's old Shorty. Well, we might as well get right along with the program, and here we go. If you think you can sing and dance, let me hip you in advance. Anyone can take a chance at amateur night in Harlem. And maybe you can hit the top. Then again, if you should flop, why, Puerto Rico's gun will pop at amateur night in Harlem. Every Wednesday night, you can find a lot of new stars to follow. When they make their debut on the stage of the old Apollo, do you know, folks, that Ella Fitzgerald started here? And you, too, can start a great career. All get thrown out on your ear. It's amateur night in Harlem. Take it, Tab Smith.
Tab Smith.
You're going to be hearing more about those two amateur musicians, Tab Smith and Tab Jordan. Well, let's get on with the program, and here we go. Now, if you think you're a future star, makes no difference who you are. Just latch on, Jack, and you may go far from amateur night in Harlem. Now, if they like you, you'll be heard. Oh, yes, right on up to your very last word. That's if you don't get the old bird at amateur night in Harlem. Now, if at first you don't succeed, well, just keep on trying. Then come on backstage and tell your tale of woe to old Papa Willie Bryant. Don't despair. Keep up the fight. Maybe you'll make out all right. Well, I'll be seeing you again next Wednesday night. Goodbye, all. Take me on, boys. Goodbye.
Okay, so 1945. Yeah. So, from 1945, we're going to go all the way back to 1921. Black Swan Records is the first, no, actually it was the second. There was Broom in Boston. Black Swan was the second African-American owned and operated record label, starting with doing classical records, but expanding into the blues. They were only around for a couple of years. It was tough going for record labels in those days, even though they did have some good sellers in their blues line. Yeah. 1921 to 1923. Yeah. And so we're going to hear one example. Sorry, I didn't get, let's see, we're queued up here. And this is Hattie King Rivas singing Make More Room, and this is an arrangement by Nathaniel Dett. There we go.
There is a green hill forest
sorry to cut that short. Hattie King Rivas, very little is known about her, even though she was a fairly successful performer. She toured Europe with the Southern Syncopators, and she was in one of the stagings of Showboat on Broadway in, I think, 1932. Did you have a?
Yeah, there's a new part in ARSC, maybe that's it.
This is it, yeah. It'll be the subject of a program, Seth, when? February, yeah.
I just reviewed it in the Ars Journal, which is not out yet.
So, soon. I can tell you about that afterwards. So, anyway, I knew that program was coming up. On the other hand, how do you do this program without mentioning Black Swan? So, anyway, get back to the PowerPoint. Now, Black Swan was operating from 21 to 23, and by that time, Harlem had a Russian community. These were Russians who found they had to leave Russia in the wake of the 1917 revolution, and a number of them settled here in Harlem. And for several decades, there was a Russian community here. And this is a woman named Elena Vorontsova, who lived in Harlem and appeared in various Russian productions here in Harlem, and also at the main church for Russians in Harlem, and around New York. And wouldn't you know it, she cut some sides for Victor in, I think, 1922. We'll hear a little bit of one called "I Was at the Party." This is with a balalaika orchestra. Why don't we hear anything? There we are. Now you can't really read that. This label was pretty worn down. This is what we just heard. It had a label in English and phonetic Russian, we'll call it. Now, by that time, a Puerto Rican community was setting down roots in East Harlem. This is on the left, Victoria Hernandez, and on the right, her brother, Rafael Hernandez. Victoria operated the Hernandez Music Store and also had a record label there called Hispano, selling records very cheap. This was the Depression by the time she got that going. She was selling records for 20 cents a piece, new records, which I think tells you something about the Depression and about her audience. Now, Rafael Hernandez, in the winter of 1929 to 1930, which apparently was a pretty brutal one, as if the stock market crash wasn't enough, wrote a song that's still sung today throughout Latin America called Lamento Borincana. And it's the singer is a Puerto Rican farmer who comes down from the mountains looking to sell his goods in San Juan or one of the other cities, and finds it abandoned because of the Depression. Everyone is just gone. There's no one. So it was recorded in 1930, not a great year to be making records, but it did quite well. It struck a nerve, and it sold not only to Puerto Ricans, but to other Spanish-speaking audiences in the United States. A few years later, at her first session, Lydia Mendoza included Lamento Borincana as one of her first sides. So let's hear a little bit of this. This was recorded by Canario y su Grupo.
Sale loco de contento con su cargamento para la ciudad, para la ciudad. Lleva en su pensamiento todo un mundo lleno de felicidad, de felicidad.
So it starts off with great promise, and then with each succeeding verse, the situation becomes more and more desperate. And at the same time, speaking of that cold winter, a group called Los Reyes de la Plena recorded Los Misterios de Lenox, the Mysteries of Lenox Avenue. And we'll hear a little bit of it, but again, this is another song actually that is more explicit about the experience of newly arrived Puerto Ricans in New York, and experiencing a northeastern winter for the first time.
En la avenida de Leno se ven cosas sin igual, misterios que a mí me atotan y hasta me hacen temblar. En la avenida de Leno se ven cosas sin igual, misterios que a mí me atotan y hasta me hacen temblar.
And again, the verses go on to describe the terrible scenes of what it's like to be shivering for the first time. And this is a gentleman named Gabriel Oller, also from Puerto Rico and relocated to New York in the 1920s. He operated several labels. In the beginning, he had I believe the second store devoted to Spanish music in New York City and in Spanish Harlem. And he also had the second label recording that music exclusively. His was called Dynatone. And he, would record people, a classic independent label kind of operation, selling records in the front and making records in the back. He, like Victoria Hernandez, he was selling them cheaply, and he knew that he couldn't sell a lot of them. Apparently, he never pressed more than 200 of any title. I've never seen one. I hope they survive somewhere. I couldn't find any online, not even a label shot, I think. We're going to jump ahead by several years and also jump genres into jazz. Charlie Christian was from Oklahoma. He arrived, I think, in 1939 in New York to join Benny Goodman's orchestra. Just a fantastic guitarist who opened, new venues for the electric guitar, and still, his stuff is still, so fresh and exciting today. And he, like many other young jazz musicians at the time, when he got through with his regular gig, he would head uptown, in his case to Minton's on 118th Street. And we're very fortunate that a young jazz fan named Jerry Newman had a portable disc cutter, and he was there to capture some of these sessions at Minton's. So we're going to hear a little bit of a track called Swing to Bop. 1941. Thelonious Monk on piano, I should mention. Kenny Clark on drums. Okay. Jerry Newman recorded elsewhere, not just at Minton's and not just Charlie Christian. He recorded Art Tatum. This is an album called God is in the House. I got this on vinyl many years ago. It's on CD, and you can download it, whatever, nowadays. I'm very glad it's out there. But these are more of his recordings from various places in Harlem, the so-called after-hours joints. This is 1941, and a number of years ago, I had the privilege of spending a couple of afternoons with the great pianist Billy Taylor, who told me that when he first arrived in New York in the 1940s, he befriended Tatum, and he, after they were both done with their respective gigs, if Tatum was in town, Billy Taylor would meet him and take him up to one of the after-hours joints in Harlem, which Tatum really loved. He was blind, he needed the assistance, and he said that wherever they went, Tatum would sit down at the piano, which was often in, lamentable condition, and he'd play a long glissando. And just from that, he'd know what keys he could play in. It was just a challenge to him. So I don't know what key he's in here, but this is a little bit of Sweet Lorraine from 1941. Please go. Another pianist, Sammy Price, who was just a wonderful musician and a wonderful presence in New York's jazz and blues scene from the 1930s on until he died in the early 90s, in addition to being leading groups and being a session player for the likes of Sister Rosetta Tharpe and others. He apparently was a significant presence in Harlem politics, and you'd see him out on voter registration drives every year. So, a long and fruitful life. He arrived in New York in the 1930s, and I don't have anything quite, the item most specific to Harlem that I could find is a commercial side from 1945 called 133rd Street Boogie. I'm not sure what the significance of 133rd Street was to him, but here's a little bit of that. All right, J. Mayo Williams. I probably don't need to give him much of an introduction in this room, but I will say that he was one of the great African American recording pioneers going back to the 1920s and still very active in the 1940s. One you can see on the right when he was launching his several labels, one called Harlem, others called Ebony in Chicago. And this led to one of these things that would happened periodically in the recording business at that time. In 1946, he recorded a gentleman named Stick McGee and put out a record under the name of Stick McGee and his buddy, because it was just the two of them. And the song was Drinkin' Wine, Spody-Ody. And this was a song that McGee had picked up in the Army, one of these things that you could just make up verse after verse to. And originally it wasn't known as Drinkin' Wine, Spody-Ody. It was Drinkin' Wine, something else. A word I'm not going to say, even though we're not on television here, but this will be on YouTube eventually. So if you want to know what the real title was, come and see me afterwards. Anyway, so he cuts this, releases it in early 1947, and nothing happens, as often happens with a record. Then, out of nowhere, about a year later, it starts to move in New Orleans. But there are no records to meet the demand. And Atlantic Records, the fledgling Atlantic Records, gets wind of this, and the Erdigans decide, well, let's put out our own version. Maybe we can capitalize on this. They called up Brownie McGee, who lived in Harlem, and said, Brownie, do you think you could cut this for us? And Brownie said, that's my brother's record. So it became Stick McGee and his buddies. They put together a full group, and I think it's a song that you would recognize in that form. But we're going to hear the original.
Down in Petersburg, everything fine. All them cats is drinking that wine, drinking that mess is their delight. When you get drunk, start singing all night, drinking wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Pass that bottle to me. Drinking that mess is their delight. When it gets drunk, start fighting all night. Knock down windows and tear down doors. Drinking half gallons and calling for more. Drinking wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Pass that bottle to me. Hoy! Drink that mess.
Williams didn't have the capital to promote his own record.
Oh, give me some of that
He
slop.
licensed it to Decca, but not much
Oh,
happened
pass
with the
that
Decca
bottle to
version.
me.
And I think just to rub it in,
If you want to get along in
Atlantic took out the
Peterstown,
stab.
buy some wine and pass
Everyone
it
is
around.
switching to
Age runs up
their
to
version.
49. All them cats, they love sweet wine. Drinking wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Pass that bottle to me. Hoy! Wine, wine, wine. Elderberry.
Wine, wine, wine.
Cherry, cherry.
Wine, wine, wine.
Blackberry.
Wine, wine, wine.
Port and sherry.
Wine, wine, wine.
Oh, pass that bottle to me. Now down on Gilsey at Willie's Den, he wasn't selling but American gin. One soldier wanted a bottle of wine. He hipped that cat for $1 and a dime. I'm drinking wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Pass that bottle to me. Now I got a nickel, have you got a dime? Let's get together and get some wine. Some buys fifth and some buys fourth. When you get together, you're doing things smart. Drinking wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Wine, spody-ody, drink wine. Pass that bottle to me.
Okay, now, New York never had the urban blues scene that Chicago and Detroit and a few other cities had, but it genuinely had a blues scene with some first-rate artists, Stick McGee, Brownie McGee being among them, and Bobby Robinson, who I mentioned before. By 1950-51, he was ready to get into the business of making records, and I'm just going to read a little bit of an interview that he gave to John Broven. Then Jack Dupree lived across the street from me at 126th Street and Lenox Avenue. I lived at 108 West 126th Street, and Jack Dupree was right across at 109. So he used to sit up there. He had a piano in his house and about 7 dogs, a one-room kitchenette with 7 dogs. Anyway, he used to sit up. He'd be banging on his piano all the time and singing. We used to talk a lot, so I said, Jack, let's get together and make a record. So we went into the studios and did the record. That was the first rhythm and blues record. Stumbling Block, I believe, was first. And the biggest one was Shake, Baby, Shake. So there's Champion Jack. And now let's hear a little bit of Shake, Baby, Shake, which he put out on his Red Robin label. I don't know why I'm not getting any sound here. There we go. Okay, I don't know what the problem is. So let's move along. All right. Hal Jackson, WLIB, quite a presence from the 1940s on as a radio host and also a talent scout. And this is a theme song recorded for him in 1949 by a group called the Whispers. And I don't know if they're from Harlem or not, but I couldn't resist playing this in this presentation.
Hello to you, hello to you. Come join our company over WLIB. This is the house that Jack built, again and again you see. Featuring Harold Jackson over WLIB. He's never too busy to say hello. He's never too busy to say hello. He's never too busy to say hello. Hello, hello, hello. 1190 on your dial. Come in, Jackson. Come in, Jackson.
As I mentioned, Jackson was something of a talent scout, and one of the groups that he scouted were the Solitaires on the Apollo marquee here. The Solitaires never had any national hits, but they were hugely popular around New York and ended up recording, I think, 4 or 5 albums worth of material for the Old Town label, started by Hi Weiss. This is another label that started in Harlem on 125th Street, though they eventually moved. And while they were up there, this is a box set of Old Town doo-wop sides, and this is the Triborough Theater, and this was sort of Weiss's satellite office. He would meet groups there after the movies and audition them, and that's how he came to sign the Solitaires. So here is one of their early sides. It's doing it to me again. Let's see.
Oh, I wonder why I love you like I do. I wonder why I'm not myself at all. I feel a strange kind of feeling coming on. I wonder why. I suppose.
The Solitaires were from 142nd Street, and it's interesting, around Harlem, there were these little scenes on different blocks, different corners. Theirs was 142nd. There was a group called, let's see, let me get back to the full screen here. Now it does it. Okay, anyway. These are the Jesters, another Harlem group, and I believe that 120th Street was their base of operations. And this is another Harlem label, Winley Records, owned and operated by Paul Winley, who I still believe is still living. And one of their biggest hits, which just scraped the very bottom of the national charts, but again, a big hit around New York, was their version of a song cut several years earlier by the Detroit group Nolan Strong and the Diablos. So this is the Jesters doing The Wind in 1960. Rare case of a cover being on the same level as the original. And these are the Keynotes. They were part of a scene on, I believe, 115th Street. And I've got to try and play a track from a CD here. Whoops. We can do this. They were ahead of their time, weren't they? Okay, track 16. It doesn't seem to know that it has a CD in here. There we go.
Sweet as a flower.
Now, this is from an interesting album, a cappella auditions. These vocal groups were used to working a cappella on street corners and at school dances.
Well, it was
oops, there it is.
No greater need.
There we go. And they would, those that could afford to, would cut a cappella demos that they would send to labels around New York and elsewhere. And the Relic Records label, which made a practice of buying up, master tapes for these independent labels of the 50s that specialized in vocal groups. These tapes were just taking up space in a closet somewhere. Discovered a number of these a cappella audition tapes. And so the Keynotes, who, like the Solitaires, were a very popular group around New York, didn't make much of a mark nationally. the keynotes were one of the groups on one of these reels. So let's just hear a little bit of this. I think of things like this as they're not quite field recordings, so you're not going to hear the sound of traffic or street noise and such, but this is very much what you would have heard if you happened upon the keynotes in their neighborhood, 115th Street.
Well, it was early one morning when you came to me. Yes, early one morning when you came to me. Your clothes was torn and your eyes was full of tears. You said, Daddy, please help me get along. Yes, Daddy, please help me get along. Come and take my hand so that I'll be strong. Well, you took my money, you took my Cadillac. You even went and took the clothes off my back. Well, I still love you, baby, just like you were a queen. Yes, I still love you, baby, just like you were a queen. I love you, darling, because you came to me. Yes, rock little mama. Yes, rock little mama. Oh, rock little mama. Rock me, baby. Rock little mama. Rock me, baby. Rock little mama. Rock me all night long. Keep rocking, keep rocking, keep rocking.
You sentence me to heartache, heartbreak, and pain.
Stop me before I sing again. There we go. Let's get back to... All right, so there are the keynotes. Now, speaking of field recordings, Vanguard Records did something akin to field recording when they recorded several nights at the Apollo in 1956. It only amounted to one album of short excerpts. One can only hope that there's more in the vaults that we'll get to hear someday. But let's hear a little bit of the great Moms Medley.
Grace Kelly has nothing on me. She got a prince and I got me a cow. While she is prancing, I will be counting.
Love you madly, Daddy, and that suit fits you. I didn't think when I bought it that it would fit that nice. I like it. What's the matter now? What is the matter, Count?
What about this Ellington jive there?
Oh, the dude.
That's right.
Well, I must stay in royalty, after all. I love that royal twang to my name,
All right.
Yeah, but I mean, Duke and myself is not together. Now, that's all over with. And Count, ain't no need of you acting like that. Me and Duke is finished. I don't know where he is. I don't care, and that's that. It twerk nothing to it.
It worked.
Wasn't nothing jumping but the peas in the pot, and they would have been jumping if the water wasn't hot.
And they recorded Amateur Night, and they happened to get a group called the Heartbreakers, who were greatly prized by vocal group collectors. I think they only cut a couple of 45s, but we got just one more song from them, and here it is.
Well, we have come now to the point of our show in which we present the winner of last week. A group of young fellas who are all schoolmates together, live in the same neighborhood, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy them. Let's send out the winners of last week. I believe you did the talking for the group last week, is that right?
Yes.
And what's your name?
Paul.
Paul? What's the name of the group, Paul?
Heartbreakers.
The Heartbreakers. Look at them, you can see they mean it too. Paul, what are you going to sing for us tonight?
Come Back, My Lover.
Come Back, My Lover. All I can say to the champs is, hold on to your title. Don't let anyone take it away. Go right ahead.
Oh, Come back, my lover. Don't go away. I need your loving every day. Love you so, and I want you to know I need your love so badly. Well, I said hello. You wondered why. Oh, because of all silly lies. Love you so, and I want you to know I need your love so badly. Well, now.
They were all in high school at the time. Yeah, kids. Yeah, I mean, that's what a lot of singers would have been aiming for that in 1956, But it's also, it just shows you how emblematic Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers were of the whole vocal scene in New York. Now, over here on the left, this is the Reverend Gary Davis, and that's Sonny Terry there. And this is a 1954 10-inch album issued by Stinson Records. And that cover doesn't do the Reverend Davis any favors. And they managed to, well, let's see, on the cover they spelled his first name correctly. I think on the back they spelled Gary with 2 R's or something like that. The record has an undeservedly poor reputation. They certainly didn't break the budget recording it, but it's a remarkable document of the blues and gospel scene in Harlem in that time. That is the rural-based scene that was there. These were people who had come in from the country. Davis had cut some sides in the 1930s, and Sonny Terry had recorded a lot to this point, but they were part of a scene of blues musicians who got together regularly. And you can tell from the excerpt I'm going to play that this is not just a random pairing. Sonny Terry and Gary Davis recorded a lot. And so let's just hear something.
The song, friend, I wanted you all to understand is a song that I sing when I would get to a place that I can't pray. Begin to let this song answer for prayer when I would get so that I can sing. Time comes that you can sing when you can't pray. I begin to let this song answer for prayer. Lord, I can't make the journey by myself. Oh, Lord. Lord, I can't make the journey by myself. Oh, Lord. Out of land on the sea. I want Jesus to come and go with me. Oh, Lord, I can't make the journey by myself. Now come time that you like to have somebody to talk with. You feel good sometime if somebody just asks you what you're crying about sometime. Look like if somebody just asks you, you feel like you can open up and tell them, Lord, I can't bear this heavy burden by myself. Oh, Lord.
Now, Harlem has many churches, and so at the other end of the spectrum, numerically and musically, are groups like, this is the adult choristers of St. Philip's Episcopal Church here in Harlem. And this is, their music director was an organist named Eugene W. Hancock. This is a record from 1981. We'll just hear a little bit of it. Joe, after this next clip, you can come down. So, and then I think this is even closer. This is a church on 137th Street, the Mother African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And this is a setting of Isaac Watts's When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. Joe Patrick is going to come down and talk about the Academy of Arts and Letters, which is home to a hall where many artistically and sonically brilliant classical music recordings have been made over the years. So here's Joe Patrick.
Let's Matt, let's swap computers here. We're moving here from PC to Mac. So, No. No,
You
this.
just need that?
Yeah, just pull that out. Pull that and that. And we'll put this one here. This is not my computer, by the way, so I apologize in advance for any mishaps, but it should be fine. So anyway, you know, technically speaking, by the way, the Academy of Arts and Letters is barely in Harlem. Being that it's on the north side of 155th Street, it's actually technically in southern Washington Heights. But as we like to say, close enough for government work. It's, sorry, we'd apologize to our local government worker here.
You're in big trouble.
Yeah, 633 West 155th. That's the,
Audubon Terrace.
That's right.
Ever went to the old Museum of the American Indian? Yeah.
It's basically what the Academy of Arts and Letters is. It's an auditorium that was built in 1930 as part of a complex of historical buildings, museums, and things like that. And it was used as a concert hall, and as a lecture hall until Max Wilcox, the famous classical record producer, must have gone to an event there and decided, the acoustics are great here. I'm going to try to record here. So he brought in one of his local pianists to try it out, one Arthur Rubinstein. And for the first recording, which I'll play a little excerpt of later, was in December of 1959 at the Academy of Arts and Letters. And for almost 30 years after that, it really wasn't used by anybody other than Max. Until in 1989, a new person came in by the name of Ardith Holmgren, who's still there, and she walked in there one day and realized that the place wasn't being used very much and said, why not? She's a violist, by the way, so she had a sense of it, and she started booking it. Well, at this point, there have been more than 1,000 recordings made in the Academy since 1959, but primarily Rubinstein was the one who was using it in the early part of the 60-year period. Anyway, I want to see if we can, let's see if this, got World Series, so we're doing okay here. I'm going to show you, that's a picture of the stage with a bunch of kid violinists. It's during something called the Silverlight Music Festival. This is one of the publicity things that the Academy gives out when people ask things about it. So you can see that the stage is in front of what is about a 700-seat auditorium that's 1,440 square feet with very high ceilings. And the sound is absolutely glorious in there. It's the most natural reverberation. It's not too long. It's about 1.3 seconds, and it's smooth, and it's beautiful. And let's see what we got here. Oh, here we go. Oh, it's just another photo. This one's a little further back, so you can see that the auditorium has all the seats in front, and then there is, I'm going to see if the other picture, it probably doesn't. There isn't really a good picture that they sent of the entire place.
700 seats, you said?
About 7, I'll tell you exactly, because they actually send out a list. All right, so the stage is 24 feet from front to back at its apex and 42 feet wide. So it's actually not big enough for an orchestra. It's big, it's okay for a chamber group. It's okay for, obviously, small group solo piano is the usual usage of it. I actually once myself, because I've recorded in there about 20 times myself, I recorded a small orchestra in there, but the stage was quite packed. And as I say, usually it's also choruses, because no matter what you do, you cannot make the room sound bad, pretty much. I mean, you have to be a really incompetent engineer to make the room sound bad. Yes, John?
Aren't there a lot of string quartet recordings taken?
The Guarnieri did almost all their recordings there, with Rubinstein and without Rubinstein, mostly with Max, because wherever Max Wilcox could get it, he liked to use it. The only time he would go away from there is when it was too big, like a full orchestra, like when he did Chicago Symphony, Philadelphia Orchestra. Obviously, that couldn't be done there. But whenever he had chamber groups, solo pianists, things like that, it was all done at the Academy. And I do have one very funny thing to show you. And that's not it. Hang on. Oh, there it is. Okay, so that's a shot of the stage. Now, I just realized this tonight, looking at this picture. There's a clarinetist playing there named Rebecca Rishin. And as you see, there's chairs set up on the stage. The reason the chairs are there is that that was the day before the ceremonial that takes place in the Academy of Arts and Letters every May, third Wednesday in May, where they give out hundreds of thousands of dollars of awards to composers, authors, artists, etc. That's the main function of the Academy of Arts and Letters. It's a museum, but it also is an organization that gives out artistic awards. Now, the chairs are there because all of the awardees and the people who are members of the organization, let me know when I'm running out of time, by the way, they all sit on stage. So I'm looking at this picture and looking at this clarinetist, and I suddenly realized that the reason this clarinetist is on stage is that I brought her there the day before the ceremonial in 2013 to try out the room. And I actually ended up doing a CD with her, but not at the Academy because it turned out it was too expensive for her. The Academy is a little expensive because it has no recording equipment, no piano, nothing. So you have to bring everything in it, and plus the room itself is now, I believe, $150 an hour. So it's pretty pricey, but it's worth it if you have the budget because of the acoustics, which are as good as it gets. In any event, some of the artists who've recorded there, because they publish a list, and I ended up cutting it down to the big names as opposed to all the names, including some people you've never heard of. But some people who have recorded there: Claudio Rao, Emmanuel Axe, Kathleen Battle, the Beaux-Arts Trio, Alicia Del Rocha, the infamous Placido Domingo, Emerson String Quartet, Thomas Hampson, Byron Janis, Juilliard Quartet, Yo-Yo Ma, and Itzhak Perlman, among hundreds and hundreds of others. So that's, I mean, if you want a little sample of the sound, I will give you the first recording ever done there. That was Arthur Rubinstein in December of '59, as I mentioned, doing Brahms Piano Sonata No. 3 in F minor. Zillions of recordings out there done at the Academy. And what I'll say about recording there versus other places in Harlem and everywhere else, as Matt said, there's a lot of great churches in Harlem, but the problem, at least back in that day and even worse now, is outside noise. The Academy being deep in the building and slightly below ground and nowhere near the one train is extremely quiet. I mean, it's almost like a tomb in there. And so you can record the most spare, quiet music there effectively. That can't happen in virtually any other recording space, not even in Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall, all you hear if you sit in the back Carnegie Hall besides the concert are ambulances going by these days. And the subway makes an appearance every 3 minutes as well. So anyway, that's I don't want to take up too much of Matt's time, but I thought you should get a little bit of an idea of what this place is about, because I doubt too many jazz artists used it, but for classical, it's to this day the place. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe.
This group called Orchestra Broadway, formed in the early 60s in East Harlem by musicians actually recently arrived from Cuba. It's a combination of Cuban musicians and others born in New York or in New York from before the early 60s. They became one of the most popular groups. And of course, East Harlem produced many, many great Latin artists. I'm not going to dwell so much on them because the labels were not based in Harlem. It may seem kind of arbitrary, but the major Latin labels were along 10th Avenue in the 40s and 50s and elsewhere around Manhattan. I haven't been able to find anybody that actually had their offices in Harlem, but I wanted to get something in there. So Orchestra Broadway, and formed in the early 60s. We're going to hear something from 1976. And I chose this because it's a mixture of a studio and a outdoor recording. Although the outdoor recording, I'm a little suspicious. I think they kind of fabricated that. But the idea was to kind of give you the orchestra and also just the sound of the community, the sound of El Barrio. Okay, Eddie Palmieri needs no introduction. Jimmy Norman should be better known. He died a few years ago. He was a R&B singer with minor success, but more successful as a songwriter and collaborator with Bob Marley and others. A very interesting career. And in the 1970s, he and Eddie Palmieri got together and created kind of a salsa and soul fusion album called Harlem River Drive. And again, not recorded in Harlem, but recorded in New York for a New York label, Roulette, and very much reflecting the Harlem experience of these musicians. So let's hear a little bit of Harlem River Drive.
From 125th Street to a bridge called G-Dub, several shades of living, from diamonds to mud, a gateway to the city, just a few miles away.
1975, I think it was released. Yes?
I
Could be, I don't know. So this is Joe Bataan, an album that he released in 1975 called Afro-Filipino, which describes himself. His parents were African-American and Filipino, and he's really one of the great figures in Latin American music. And we're going to hear a bit of a tune called La Botella, the bottle. And this Joe Bataan came to do this after the previous year, Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson released the song in English, The Bottle, and it got a good response in from the early club DJs of the disco era. But the label was not used to promoting singles. And so Sylvia Robinson, who was operating All Platinum and Turbo and the network of labels in New Jersey, jumped on it, put together a studio group called Brother to Brother, issued a single, and she had the hit with it. And Joe Bataan evidently felt that there was still something left for him to do with it, and so he put kind of a Latin and a disco spin on it. And this was really, I think, just a hit around New York, but very much of the era and, and of Harlem and Spanish Harlem at the time. This himself, took it around to club DJs on his own. There's Bobby Robinson, who we've already talked about. He had a good run of hits in the late 50s and into the 1960s, and then in the 1970s he still running his record store, but pretty much retired from recording. He was raising a family. In fact, he was raising his sister's children. She had died at a young age. And so, he was more of a spectator on the music business and musical happenings in Harlem. And this is from one of his interviews with John Broven. He was really very eloquent on the whole subject. Doo-wop originally started out as the black teenage expression of the 50s, and rap emerged as the black teenage expression of the 70s. Same identical thing that started it. The doo-wop groups down the street, in hallways and alleys and on the corner. They'd gather anywhere, doo-wop, doo-da, wa-da-da-da. You'd hear it everywhere. So the same thing started with rap groups around 76 or so. All of a sudden, everywhere you turned, you'd hear kids rapping. In the summertime, they'd have these little parties in the park. They used to go out and play at night, and kids would be out there dancing. All of a sudden, all you hear was hip-hop, hit the top, don't stop. It's kids, to a great extent mixed up and confused, reaching out to express themselves. They were forcefully trying to express themselves, and they made up in fantasy what they missed in reality. And again, speaking of rap, he said, it had been around since 1976, and I was aware of it. Kids walking down the street with big boxes that you'd hear blasting all over. It was the kind of thing where you'd hear kids do it in the street. Everybody would laugh. Maybe it was because I wasn't actively recording. I kicked myself because I should have been the first one out with a record. My good friend Sylvia Robinson at Sugar Hill came out with the first giant rap record, and she didn't know from nothing until she happened to hear it. She heard it one Saturday night and flipped. That's to David. This is to David Toop, not John Broven. Though there's Rapper's Delight. Now, it wasn't just that it was going on around him. It was going on in his own home. Bobby Robinson's nephew was a young man known as Spoonie G. And he actually worked in the Happy House record store, cut a record on his own, and around this time, as Rapper's Delight was breaking big in the fall of 1979, Bobby Robinson decided, well, it's time to get back into the recording game. And using his nephew and some other kids as talent scouts, he hooked up with a drummer named Errol Pumpkin Bedward. This is from the Bronx. Most of the early rap artists were from the Bronx. And brought in a group called the Funky Four plus one more. And this was a big, big record around New York and maybe a few other places. It never made any chart, but it sold very well. And I was a freshman at NYU, fall of 1979. I remember this record. You just heard it. So this is before sampling. It's a live band. Robinson didn't think it would sound good, and also he was worried about legal issues, so I had a group recorded in the back of his store on actually around the corner from 120.
This is the way we rock the house. Sure enough, everybody gonna turn it out. Well, I'm kicking rock well, cause the rock's so swell. Every time you hear my name, it rings a bell. Well, I'm leading right to see, making history with all the fly girls yelling, take me.
Well, I'm star rockin', I can't be stopped for all the fly guys gonna hit the top.
Well, I'm Keith, or you can call me Keith Caesar. The reason why, cause I'm the women pleaser. Well, I'm Jazzy Jeff with the most finesse. Say I do it to the rhythm till I do it the best. Now we're the Funky Four.
And I'm the plus one more.
And this is the way we go back and forth. With the 5 MCs that are too much. When we rock the mics and with the magical touch. We're on time, we're masterminds. We hypnotize when we run down the rhyme.
Therefore, fly guys, I'm the best female. I'm telling the truth, not a fairy tale.
Now listen to the story that the 5 put down. And it's guaranteed, so let the travel around. Now we said it once and we said it twice. And we're proving to you that we're better than nice.
Okay, had some other rap records queued up here, but it is getting late, so I want to cut to the chase here. This is Marian Anderson in 1952, recorded at Lewiston Stadium, which was mere blocks from here in those days. Lewiston was on campus here, I believe, from 1915 to 1973, and was torn down and was the site of many great outdoor concerts, several of them featuring Marian Anderson. So here's one from 1952. This is the beginning of the outdoor concert season for that summer.
Marian Anderson has concluded tonight's stadium concert with a group of 3 spirituals. The gospel train, sometimes I feel like a motherless child, and every time I feel the spirit. I don't know whether Miss Anderson is going to sing more for us tonight or not, I asked her before the concert began what her encores were to be, and she said her pianist was out of town on his vacation and she had not planned to sing any encores. But I offered to play for her, and a few minutes later, Maestro Metropolis offered to play for her, but she hadn't rehearsed anything in addition, so it's just a possibility that she may repeat the last spiritual which she has just sung.
That's what she did, in fact. So, anyway,
I think you got that pretty far short. At least the next step.
the transfer. Yeah, well, that's, I didn't make that transfer. I just copied the file. It's probably, happened at the time. I mean, it was a recording off the radio, and yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, must have been.
I may have been there.
Really?
Well, my aunt took me there so many times in that year.
Yeah, must have been grand.
I don't remember it. Stone.
Yeah.
No. No, I just remember going there that summer a lot.
Yeah, my father told me, with his father, we're going back to, I don't know, maybe the mid-30s.
Mm-hmm.
That in the back were all stone seats, ledges to sit on. So when you walked in, if you paid a dime, they gave you a straw mat to sit on. They rented you straw mats.
Yeah, yeah.
You can see the pictures of it in the movie Serpico, right before they tore it down. Johnson Serpico in Winston-Salem.
Oh, thank you. Okay, yeah, and I can picture it now. I didn't make the connection. Yeah, yeah. It wouldn't be the case in 1952, but that's it from recorded off of WNYC. And a few years later, they were doing early stereo transmissions over NYC FM and NYC AM.
They were the first to do it.
Yeah.
According to Andy Land, said NYC was doing it a few months before QXR could do it. But they had to do that because they hadn't come up with a multiplex system.
Yeah, because I know, and we have some Lewiston Stadium concerts, I think in the VOA collection, actually.
Yeah.
And, they start off with a lengthy announcement about how to listen to it in stereo, which, good luck. Right. So first of all, go out and buy another radio, and then, right. Right. Yeah. Any, well, as I say, I know there are other ones in the VOA collection. I could look it up. I know there's a few because I've heard them. No, they're not available online, but.
There's a listing of what the New York Public Library got from the library.
Okay, yeah.
And the earliest one we have in there is from the summer of 1950. And one of them, or in 51, there was a memorial to Kurt Weill. That was done up there. That just went on, I think went on for 2.5 hours.
Wow.
It just kept, NYC was a public, city-owned station. No commercials, they just kept going. And they also did, I found one in 50, an NBC telecast of a Beethoven violin concerto with Francis Scotti and Vladimir Goldsman.
Mm-hmm.
And you can actually hear the noise. It may have been Kinney because you hear film noise in the broadcast.
Okay.
Those typical noises when a film scratches.
What do you want for a dime? Come on, I mean, what do you want for a dime? I mean,
Yeah, the funny thing
and you
was-
get a seat too, so.
The funny thing was, I think Ben Brower announced it as Francis Scotti comes up to say, "Come look at yourself on television." He could see himself on a monitor as he was walking on off the stage. I don't think the Kinney to that exists anymore.
Did you got the audio?
We got the audio.
In the library?
Yeah. Yeah. I must say, there was one other funny one. Montour conducted in one of those, and the announcer from NYC said he had done an intermission with Montour to San Francisco earlier that month. So he comes backstage and sits down and says, "Maestro Montour, it's so good to see you again." "Oh, it's good to see you. What is your name again?" Yeah.
So, anyway, I mean, this was just a survey, by no means exhaustive, of, Harlem's recording legacy. There's, I think any one of these areas, you could probably, do a good evening around, and, you know, if we get to actually do a symposium somewhere, you know, there's several topics. I mean, you could do a presentation just on recordings made at the Apollo, I think, you know. Yeah, so if there aren't any more questions, thank you all for coming.